Scott County, providing safe, healthy, and livable communities.
You're in charge. Take it away.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. This is our first Scott Delivers panel presentation discussion in front of the Board of Commissioners. We have been working towards this over the last couple of years. This is where different departments, different initiatives bring their data and their information forward to share, and how it contributes to delivering what matters, and what they're doing is meeting the board's goals and strategies that have been set out. And over the course of the year, you're going to see some that are by department. This one is by the Highway Department and Transportation Unit today, including transit and some of the ops things. And over time, we'll evolve towards more of some of your strategies, where you'll see some collaborative discussions and information being brought forward. And so the first part is the panel. Jake, Chris, and Steve and I will ask some questions of the data after these guys introduce themselves and the role they play in transportation. And then we will turn it over for questions. And it's going to be a little different today, because we'll ask the audience when they're going to have a question to walk up to the microphone so that we can capture it on the video today for the residents as they're watching this. And at that time also the board will participate in the questions. So with that, Tony, I'm going to turn it over.
Leslie, well, for the members, edification of the new members, would you remind us who's in the audience, who makes up the audience that's going to be peppering you with questions?
Well, the audience could be anybody from a township member to staff to hopefully someday maybe even some residents would come and participate in this if they found a topic. Right now it tends to be mostly staff and folks that might be engaged in some of the items that we're talking about today. So,
thank you.
With that, Tony, why don't you guys introduce yourself, and then you take 3 minutes to kind of give some background on what we're looking at, and we'll turn it over to the panel.
Very well. Good morning, Mr. Chair, Commissioners, panel, and those in the audience. Tony Winnicky, I am the Scott County Highway Engineer.
Kate Miner, the Traffic Engineer for the Highway Department.
And I'm Lisa Fries, and I'm the Transportation Program Director responsible for programming and planning.
Good morning, I'm Kurt Kobolarsik, Assistant County Engineer.
I'm Troy Beam, Transit and Fleet Manager.
Joe Wida, Highway Maintenance Operations and Facilities Management.
Well, with everybody introduced here, I think I'll kick it off by talking a little bit about what we're hoping to accomplish today here. What we're trying to do with the Transportation Department is focus in on what role we play with the County Board's goal of transportation and land use in facilitating safe, healthy, and livable communities. We have several of the results maps that were identified through the citizen outreach process, where we touch the community and the programs and services that we provide. And today we're going to focus in on 3 key outcomes that are related to transportation and related to the board's objectives. Safe, we're going to try to walk through how residents are safe on our highways, trails, and transit systems, and show you the data that demonstrates that. We're going to talk about mobility and the work that we do in programming, planning and programming projects so that our residents have access to connected, efficient, and reliable trips, both on the highway system, the trail system, and on the transit system here in the county. And then the other goal that we're going to work on trying to show you the outcomes that we've achieved is in the area of economic development. And we're going to have data here that focuses in on how residents and businesses have access to economic development opportunities through those highway and transit systems that we have invested in. We have a variety of different things that we do, and I think one of the key things is that we have a fairly robust process that's supported for planning and then programming and implementing our decision making, and we've been doing that for quite a while here at the county, so we keep getting better at that. We have to work within a regional and state system where plans are developed, and we have to be consistent with those. And then we have to bring it down to our county system level and corridor level to make things happen. And it requires a lot of data as we go through the process of making decisions for responsible and cost-effective investments. Things that factor into our decision-making are making sure that we have compatible land uses along our arterial corridors, that there's a connected local road network, or at least there's one being planned by the local communities and the townships in the area to support those arterial roads, that we can help our residents and our businesses have predictable and safe trips along our corridors, both in transit and in vehicles. And that we have a connected system for pedestrians and bikes connecting to our highway and transit system. And that all of these services and infrastructure investments that we make focus in on and contribute to the economic vibrancy of the community. And then we are working hard. I think it's kind of a new in our horizon, but for the last couple of decades, we've been focusing in on linking transit with our housing, shopping, and employment. I think one of the things with all of these efforts that we know is very important is that we have to work with our partners, that we can't do these things alone, and that we have to be connected to our cities, our townships, the region, the state, and working through a variety of different investment decisions. We have a fairly straightforward process where we have a 20-year plan, and that really sets the vision and goals in which we work in, and then we step it down to a 10-year transportation improvement program, which identifies how we're going to make those investments, and a lot of what we do to make decisions and prioritize those investments is based on data, both safety data, mobility data, gaps in the system, all of those kinds of things influence how we look at and work with the county decision makers to make those decisions. We also have a follow-through. Once we develop a project, we have construction and design and construction help us deliver those projects, and then once they're delivered, we have an ongoing responsibility to maintain those both, and that's where our maintenance operations plays into that. So we've attempted to try to identify all the partners that are involved in this. There are quite a number of them, both internal here in the county, but also external. Within the county here, we work with planning and zoning, natural resources, parks and trails, public health, a whole variety of folks within them. Within our group, we have transit and mobility management and other support services. But we also have to work with external partners as well, and that's where we work with our cities, our bordering counties, our region, the regional services through the Met Council. We have identified in and we have quite a number of snapshots for your consideration today. What we're starting to develop as key performance measures. And are we there yet completely? Probably not, but we're starting to get them more aligned with the board's objectives, and I think we're doing a good job of using that data in making our day-to-day decisions. So with that, I'll turn it back to the...
So over to you three.
Well, could I just start? I thought it was really well put together. You do have a lot of measures. There was a lot of snapshots, and I have some kind of specific questions about those snapshots. But I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about, like, as you're trying to figure out what are those key measures, how did you pick these? How did they rise to the top?
Well, I'll look for other folks to jump in, but I think some of these we've been working with for 3 or 4 years. Some of them are starting to emerge. But we also have a framework where both at the federal, state, and local level, we have performance measures that we are being asked to provide as feedback for how we're doing with those agencies. And some of those are included in our performance measures, but then we have other measures that go beyond those that really dig into how we prioritize and make investment decisions, how we feel that we're supporting the board's objectives with safe and livable and healthy communities. But I think that part of the challenge is there are so many areas that we touch is to try to pick one performance measure that fits all things. And we have to have a different one for bike and ped, a different one for transit, a different one for highways and safety. So as we kind of went through them, we tried to say, well, what performance measures do we have that fits those objectives, and is that a key performance measure or a supporting performance measure? And that's kind of the exercise that we've gone through over the past few months and working through what you have today presented to you.
Nice.
Did you also find yourself, as you were preparing for this, that you just debated about what other measures could we start or establish to see that it would show more towards your goal itself too? So not just existing measures?
We certainly had some measures that aren't there yet. They're either under development or we only have partial data for. So, or we don't think really aligns with what we're trying to measure. And so I think there are a few that we identified here that we need to develop, and they're in process, or we're not sure if we can develop them yet.
So can you go to page 12? Kate, will you explain page 12 to me a little bit? This is, when you look at page 11, it's our crash rates, and we do fairly well overall statewide, which is really a good sign. But we have things in the tip that are above that.
Yep.
So can you explain the different, because one of these is kind of new to what we're looking at.
Okay. So page 12 covers 3 different corridors that are in the tip, and this is kind of how we look at the safety aspect of the priority of putting those projects in the tip. So we'll start with CASA 42, the first 3 bars on the graph, and the blue bar is our crash rate along that corridor. So our crash rate is 1.56 crashes per million vehicles along that corridor. So that's what that number tells us. So what does that mean? And that's when we start the comparisons. The statewide average for a roadway of that type, with, you know, kind of the same dynamics, the same cross-section, the same volumes, is 0.61. So you can see we're well above that for that corridor. We're almost double what the average crash rate on a typical roadway that corridor is. So recently, I mean, that's kind of what we've looked at in the past, and we've kind of gone, wait, we've got a problem there. This is really problematic. We need to do something. There's another measure out there that we've kind of more recently started using called the critical crash rate. And the critical crash rate is a statistical formula that helps us take out, I guess, the randomness of crashes, if you will. So as we know, crashes are random. They can be caused by, you know, we may have a problem at an intersection or along a corridor where we get higher crash rates, but it's also sometimes they're random. We can't do anything. There's a reason they're accidents, they're crashes. So what that formula for the critical crash rate does is it takes out the randomness of crashes for us. So it can say with a 92% probability, we can say that this is either a problem along this corridor that's location specific, or maybe we just had 3 years where we just had a little bit higher crashes because of the randomness. The next 3 years, we're going to have nothing. So that kind of tells us if we've got a location-specific problem when we look at that critical crash rate. So if you look at these bars, our critical crash rate along 42, along that stretch between 17 and 83, is 1.24. So that's above the state average. So what that tells us is that our critical crash rate for that corridor tells us that we've got problems, location-specific problems along that corridor. Because our critical crash rate is higher than our state crash rate, our regular crash rate is higher. The line along there kind of shows the critical index, which is our crash rate over our critical crash rate. That kind of gives us an index. So that's a great number to be able to compare when you start looking. If your critical crash index, which is our third bar, that pink one, is above 1, we've got location-specific problems along the corridor. If we are under 1, we may have some problems if we're above that state crash rate, but there's probably an element of randomness thrown in there. We don't necessarily need to knee-jerk react right away. It's probably something we want to watch. We want to see what happens over, time, if those crashes continue or not. So you can see on 42, our critical crash rate index is 1.26. That tells us something's going along that corridor. There's something location-specific along there that we probably need to get in there and do something with.
Thank you.
So let's say you have a critical crash index that exceeds 1.0. What other data do you start to look at then?
So at that point, we probably need to look at what type of crashes are happening. Are they happening at the intersection? Are they corridor type crashes? Are they rear end crashes? Are they off the road crashes? We kind of start to look at what the these crashes are. Are they high severity? Are they lower severity? This is all crashes that we're looking at right here. We do start to take out severity crashes, your fatalities, your high injury crashes, and we can kind of start to take a look at that and see what do we need to correct along there? What do the crashes look like? So we start to dig into a little bit more detail of not just the number of crashes, but now we start to parcel those out and what types
So
are they.
looking at the data that would be on page 13, the very next page, starting to look at what's the total crash, what's the severity rate,
Right.
and trying to understand. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit, can we go back to page 11 for just a second? So one of the pieces, and it shows up in a number of places in your presentation where there's this, like, we're going to do a project and then we're going to reevaluate, did we get what we wanted out of that project? And then on this slide, it talks about if there's a fatal crash, there is a review, and do those really serious accidents inform what you do next and how you land projects and things? Is there a communication plan to citizens? Like, do they know as system improvements are made? Because that seems like a really, a piece that would make your system really so strong, is that ability to review those accidents and kind of inform what you do next. Is there a communication plan with citizens or with other people about the improvements you're making?
Maybe you could talk a little bit about the committee that we have
Yeah.
to review crashes?
So, Towards Zero Death is a Minnesota initiative, statewide Minnesota initiative. We are members of that. Our sheriff's department is a member of that. We have started a Towards Zero Death county-wide coalition that not only includes county agencies, but also includes other stakeholders, if you will. So TZD kind of addresses emergency management, it addresses engineering, it addresses enforcement, thank you. So those are the E's, and then they added another one, they're saying everyone. So we have all these stakeholders. So we've started a coalition within our county that is led by the Shakopee PD is the chair of that. I'm the co-chair of that committee. So we have police departments throughout the county on that. We have engineering staff. I don't believe right now we have anybody from emergency management sitting on that committee, but we've been trying to pull them in. So we do have a fatality review committee. We look at that holistically countywide from all those, the E's going into that, so yes.
Okay.
Is there a way, though, to Chris's point, that's communicated countywide? Do we put anything in the scene or something like that where we communicate any of those outcomes?
Not specifically, although I think the scene, the summer scene, I think had one of our snapshots. Was it 17? I think it was the 17, which is in this packet here. That we did show the success of our projects and what we're trying to accomplish, kind of before and after conditions. But surely in the development of all of our projects, and we have open houses and public information. We share that information and why what we're trying to accomplish with that project. And in all of our projects, there's a safety component. Every single one of our projects is a safety component. So that is relayed to the public during that time as well, of why we're doing this project. And it's a huge part of that decision process as well.
Nice.
No, I really found this chart fascinating because you have it both at a local, regional level and then also at the state level. And I got a little concerned when I saw, thinking of our citizens, it's great Scott County's going down in crash rates, but it really concerned me seeing the metro average has really increased in 2013 and 14. And just knowing the metro population's 55% roughly of the state population, I thought maybe the traffic level was around that same level too then, so that 55% of all traffic is in the metro, leaving only 45 for non-metro, that the actual non-metro crash rate would be along the lines of a 0.5 or so to keep the state average consistent at 1.5. So knowing that, the target really is 0 deaths and you really would like to not have any crashes, I'm just a little concerned, should we start working with the state more to maybe transition some funding to more metro locations rather than
So
non-metro?
that's kind of a tricky question a little bit. So I get where you're going with your math, but the funny part about traffic, and especially when you're talking fatalities and serious injuries, the majority of your fatalities are rural in nature, even though you don't have the volumes out there. They're high speed, they're off the road crashes, where they're rolling cars, they're, hitting things off the road. So they tend to be more serious in nature, even though there isn't as many of them. And there has been definitely some statewide efforts. MnDOT led a program a couple of years ago where we did a county safety plan. And they helped all 87 counties put something together. It was kind of a proactive safety plan. So not necessarily a holistic safety plan, but maybe a proactive, what can we be doing? Where are our spots that could potentially be hazardous for us, and what can we be doing to fix those? They're kind of starting round 2 of those safety plans to update those. So definitely there are efforts going on statewide, and MnDOT's been a great leader of those, and State Aid has been a great leader of those. And we've been involved with all those projects. So.
Perhaps another point to make on the metro area rise. The one other thing that has happened in the metro area is that the last couple of years, after seeing kind of a decline in the rise of congestion, it's starting to go back up again. And so we would need to have the metro look at what's driving the crash rate increase, but I would not be surprised if congestion is a factor.
I think congestion, and I think if you really dig down into those numbers to try to figure out why that rise is, we've for sure, and I'm not sure if it started as back as 2013, but for sure the last couple of years, and I'm sure you've heard about it in the news maybe even, they've been talking about it a lot, we have seen a huge increase in pedestrian crashes. Now those are going to be all metro rural, or urban in nature rather than rural, but for some reason, and I'm sure it's because we have, put a lot of money into trails and we're starting to look at multimodal. We have a lot more conflicts out there and trails crossing our roadways these days as we used to. So the last couple of years, pedestrians have been on the rise as far as crashes. And so that may be a little bit of why that's dipping up those last couple of years.
And I think the distracted driver factor
Right.
too.
Cell phones.
Definitely.
Can we go to page 16? So I wanted to ask about this slide just because really almost, or many of the slides that you presented, Scott County is at or above meeting goals and kind of a high-performing county in a lot of respects. And this was a place where that was kind of below a state standard. And I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about your understanding about that, or if I'm maybe not looking at the slide correctly, but could you just talk a little bit about what some of the challenges are? Because the performance is pretty set and below the state guideline or the state target.
Joe, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I can try. So the target is not really a state average, that's a kind of an internal target rate for us
Okay.
internally.
County board adopted.
Oh, that's nice though. So you guys set that.
The county
County
board
board.
did.
Oh, nice.
It's part of our plan.
Yep. So, I mean, it is slowly trending upwards, as we've, in the last few years have been getting increased funding. There's lots of miles to maintain, obviously, but we've almost doubled our seal coat maintenance. Our overlays are increasing in frequency. So, I mean, like I say, it's a slow trend, but it is trending towards that point.
Okay.
When do you measure it again, Joe? When will you find out more?
This summer, MnDOT comes back, so they do it every 4 years, and do the entire system with one of our staff,
Wow.
so.
Wow.
Now, in a perfect world, we're 5 years out from now, how much more funding do you think you would need to be at, to be able to be at that 72 rating?
I don't know if I can realistically answer that, but we are working, towards that with some of Lisa's group from the planning standpoint.
Yeah, we currently are trying to get a better handle on getting towards that number. We've actually increased our pavement investment by between 2 and 4 million the last few years, and hopefully when we do that benchmarking next year, we'll be at a better place. But we will continue to need to make increased investment in our pavements in order to approach that target. And we're right now really trying to get a better handle on, is it even reachable with our current investment levels that we have planned?
Are there other barriers besides funding?
The size of our system really is an impact on how much it takes for us to manage that. We have a pretty large pavement, or pretty large system to manage, particularly because we have a lot of rural roadways. And some of our roadways, the way that they were originally constructed many, many years ago, impact how much it takes for us to continue to maintain them.
Sure.
We do a lot better job currently in making sure our roads are constructed so that they last a long time, but construction practices 25 to 30 years ago were not the same as they are today.
Weather is also a factor. I mean, this winter, even though not as many events, but these rain events like this where you get a lot of freeze thaw, you can really see a difference in it. So that could hamper the MnDOT rating this year.
Yep. And beyond your control.
Right.
It gets a piece that
Correct.
you just can't control for.
Do you benchmark with other counties too to see at what rating are their roads? For just a comparison, how are we in regards to, say, a Carver County, Dakota County?
That is something that we haven't done yet. Each county measures things a little bit different, and they have different benchmarks, but it's certainly something that as we get more into this, we'll probably start trying to see how we do compared to other counties.
Is that solely for bragging rights? To be able to say we've got a higher PQI than Dakota and Carver, or is there something that it might reveal something to your department to say that Dakota's up here and Carver's up here and we're still, what would that tell you if that were the case?
Well, I think that we have looked at it more of a pavement investment type of focus, and we've taken the data and said this is what it's going to take in order to be at that right place in time for making investments and preserving that existing infrastructure. And we haven't looked to our peers to set that goal, but rather we looked at the infrastructure and what it takes to do it. Now, we could look at it in terms of are we focusing more than a Carver or Dakota or less, or do we have a different circumstance than they do in terms of how their roads were originally built? There are many factors as to whether they're performing better or worse than we are, and so I think we've been more inward with how we've been focusing on how we do our investments, because it's how we maintain that stuff for the long run.
It makes sense. It matters to the residents here in Scott County.
This is one where there's lots of other measures below it. You'd have percent in failure, you'd have percent at 100%. So you have a whole curve on this one of where you want your roads to be. You certainly don't want them all at 100% if you're going to construct it in the next year. So this is one where you could really drill down into more graphs and data about where their roads are at.
It is really interesting when you do look at other counties. You know, we built a lot of our roads a long time ago on the clays, and it's a lot of moistures, and it really damages our pavements today. If you look at a place like Anoka County, they're built on the sand plain up there. So if you go in there and do a project, you're not having to get as expensive to redo the projects as you have to do down here. So up there they can do some mill and overlays, and the sand base is already there, the roads aren't in bad a shape. Down here, you know, we have the clays, and they're built on the clays, and there's a lot of need out there right now.
Dakota is 3/4 built on gravel mines, so it's a whole different world depending upon what your subgrade is.
So maybe another comment on that as far as picking that PQI, that 72. And as Leslie had mentioned, we've got a lot of roads that, I mean, you could have some in the 30, 40s, you've got, you know, some in the 90s. You've got a whole range, and so you package that with projects that are coming up, and we may let a project go. It's like, it's going to deteriorate over the next couple of years, and we're likely to hear that. But we know that, you know, that would be a very short-term investment if we were actually going to do a mill and overlay for that short period of time, knowing we've got a project that's coming up. So the software that we have to help manage this, we can put those different investment levels in. And of course, we have to analyze that every single year based on what Joe is saying, you know, the different seasons that we have and what that might mean. So, you know, this will be another good benchmark for us this summer in 2017 to see where we are as a system as a whole. And then again, we can kind of look at the investments that we have in the tip right now, the dollars that we have in, and what we can kind of foresee those PQIs might be down the road.
One of the things that you'll see is that oftentimes, especially in our projects where we're going to be reconstructing the whole roadway, like a County Road 16, which we just completed last year, we work, if you look at the PQI on that roadway prior to construction, it was pretty low, but that was deliberate because we knew we were going to be completely reconstructing the road. And rather than making an investment 5 or 6 years ago, once that became part of the transportation improvement program, we just managed it with maintenance type of activities until we got to the reconstruction.
I have a question. There's not a particular slide, so you can just leave it where it is. I think there's a lot of data in here. Your three outcomes that you articulate on page 1 are safety and mobility, and a lot of the data in here does a really good job of showing this is how general, this was the crash rate before, and this is the crash rate after, this is the mobility before and after a project. The economic development one, I think there was one slide, and I forget the page, that was just existing employment within 1 mile of a particular project. Do you currently collect any data on that economic development goal of a highway and transit system that supports economic vitality? And if so, if not, what is it? What might it be? So that you could start to look at the before and after. If you have a project, what was the market valuation before, after? Is there any impact on that other than this is what exists when we do a project, and that's our economic development indicator? Are there other pieces of data out there that could help tell that part of the story, how your projects, transit or highway related, are impacting the economy?
I think there are a number of measures. In fact, we're working on one right now for the 169 mobility project, the Tiger project that we received funding for, and we're required as a part of that project to come up with performance measures. And there we're looking at a couple of economic development types of performance measures that will probably focus in on employment and valuation increases in probably commercial and industrial land along the corridor as performance measures. The one challenge that we have is that some of our corridors are really for mobility and don't have employment along them, and other corridors, they're clearly employment type corridors, like along County Road 83. If you look on the one measure that's in there, we have quite a bit of employment along that corridor. But other corridors that get people to and from work maybe don't have as much employment along them. So there's different characteristics of different corridors, and I think we'd want to pick those corridors that really support employment and goods and service mobility for those measures if we were to go that route. Yeah, this is actually taken from data that we need to produce for the regional applications. This particular slide, and it shows existing employment. We could also look at regional projections for future employment in that area. We could look at in the future how those corridors fare in terms of employment growth after the projects as well.
Now, I did find slide 35 and slide 36, where it's talking about roads that are up to the 10-ton level or limit, that probably does help some with economic development. I was thinking along the lines of, say, in Amazon, that you probably needed a stronger road or a heavier duty road for all of the traffic that they'll be going with outside of their facilities. And it does, especially looking at slide 36, it does look like you have put a lot of funding towards upgrading the roadways. What I couldn't tell from this is, did you have to upgrade the roads specifically around Amazon, or for the most part were their main roads already at the higher level?
Well, if you look at the map on page 36, the facilities that are within most of the three northern communities, for the most part, are already 10-ton. There were a few small gaps that recently we've upgraded, but those roadways have historically been 10-ton roadways in those communities, or they've been upgraded prior to when we started this mapping. This really starts with 2012 and said which roads as of 2012 were 10-ton roadways. And we probably need to go back and research history about when those roads were upgraded and when they became 10-ton roads on the system to really get at your question more specifically.
But they already existed, though. That's
Yeah.
the important part. Okay.
Can you, as long as we're on this slide, is the goal to have, please forgive my ignorance, okay? But is the goal to have 100%? Or do you just need to have 10-ton roads in all the right places?
I would say the goal should be to have 10-ton roads in the right places that serve the land use that support the industry rather than everywhere, because we can't afford to do everything everywhere.
So with that 90%, right, it's the 90%, right? Yeah, 90% in 2016. So do you have a way to interlay that over, like, here's where, is that 90% of where we need it, or is that 90% of the roads?
I would say that we're probably closer to 100% of where we need it.
Oh,
For
nice.
right now, where the planned development and existing development is at. But we did not evaluate it in that manner, so that's a good suggestion. We should go back and look at it that way.
All right, sorry, whoever's running the mouse, to go back to page 6. Sorry. So you have a section here, missing links in service integration. Misalignment in development decisions and transportation systems, and you have a couple bullets there. Lack of development density to support efficient and regionally competitive transit. Lack of good site planning for pedestrian bike infrastructure. Is that the county perspective, your perspective, and that it can be maybe yes or no? And then if other jurisdictions were represented here, as you mentioned, it's not just the county having these conversations and working on these projects, it's multi-jurisdictional. Would the cities, would townships, the state, would their concerns, their missing links there, do you think they'd line up with ours?
Well, Troy, you might want to jump in on this one a little bit, because transit service is something that really requires concentration.
It does require concentration. People will drive to the point of congestion, and so that's where they'll drive to. When you don't have congestion, it's tough to invest money in those areas that don't require that kind of service. That's where the dollar ride services make up the difference. And so we are having a high number of denials in the dollar ride area because we don't have the resources to add dollar ride. So that adds some aspect to it.
I think you've hit on a key point. We really do need, and we work hard at trying to engage the communities. We have a transit waste study that's going on right now, and one of the key things about whether or not it can be successful in Scott County is it's going to require the local communities to think a little bit differently around those station areas about how they develop. We have a circulator fixed route service that is run by Minnesota Valley Transit Authority, and in order for it to be successful, we need to think about housing and where it develops along those lines, employment, so that it can be continue to have more ability to generate riders without as much subsidy. And those are very important types of things. And so it gets complicated because we have transit providers like MBTA, we have local communities like the cities that are making decisions about land use and development, and then we have regional agencies that are making decisions about level of subsidy, and all of those folks really need to work together in order to put that kind of cost-effective service on the ground.
So go to 29 then, to Troy's point. There was just an article in Southwest in the newspaper in their flex service and how their wait times are increasing, you know. What is this graph telling us, Troy?
Well, this tells us that you can see that the number of denials when we started out in 2006, and they've nearly doubled now or tripled in 2016. And sometimes you'll see that, like in 2014, you'll see that the numbers were pretty consistent, but a lot of it has to do with you know, where the people want to go and the times of service. People want, right now, they want door-to-door service, and they want it as quick as possible. And sometimes that becomes very complicated, especially with the dollar ride system. But the denials continue to increase, and as the senior population increases, these numbers are going to get higher. And so with Southwest and their service, they have a door-to-door service. It's really route to route, and it's more of a on-demand service. And it's a lot different. It's a whole different ridership. So it's not your handicapped person that needs to get from point A to point B. It's not your senior citizen. In some cases it is if it's a local service. But typically, those are commuters trying to get to their last mile destination. And that's what they want. They want to use it like an Uber cab. And it's become very popular. The problem is that it's expensive to operate, and you have to make sure that demand is there. And with Southwest, the demand is there, but they haven't got the resources to add services, and they only offer service from 6 to 6.
So with this, do we know where these denials are at?
We do. We have, they're zip code to zip code. We don't have we typically have address to address. We can tell you where they are, but we're not allowed to track that for whatever reason. The Met Council has rules about what you can do.
Are they rural or urban in nature?
Most of them, I think, are rural, I believe. We do a good job when there's a lot of density, we try to do a really good job there because it becomes natural. We use, like Shakopee, for example, as a hub. So we'll bring people in from all over the county to the hub and distribute them from there. because it makes more sense operationally for us to do that. And part of the reason that we have, and if you can compare it to other counties, you know, we do a really good job in terms of our ridership per hour. We do about 5 passengers per hour, where most of the other counties are at,
32.
on page 32. You can see that the number of trips that we've provided in the same period of time is double for most of the other counties, with the exception of Washington and Ramsey. And then the passengers per hour. So part of that reason is because we don't have any other local service. Page 32.
There you go.
Yeah. So we don't have any other fixed, we have mostly fixed route services from Shakopee, Prior Lake, and Savage. But we don't have any fixed route services beyond that point, so kind of to your point. And so they rely heavily on Dollaride because we don't have any even local services in the rural areas. So all they have is Dollaride. And so we do a really good job of trying to put people together, our resources together to make that happen.
Troy, on slide 30 or graph chart 30, looking at chart 30, looking at the Dial-A-Ride from 2014 to 2016, there has been a drastic decline, though, in the rides provided through Dial-A-Ride at the same time that the denials have really increased.
Correct.
Do they correlate with each other, or?
So let me elaborate on, this is specific to medical trips. So, and what happened in this is part of our medical assistance, transportation. What happened was the state changed the rules. I think they changed them, I don't recall for sure, but it was in, I think, 14. They changed the rules for how people could qualify for medical assistance trips. And so, and the services providers, like the hospitals and the clinics that they were allowed to go to. So I think, and I know, John, you can probably touch base on that a little bit more than I can, but I know that they changed the rules, I think, in 14, and that's why there was a decline. So more people are driving themselves versus using transportation. And so.
I have one more question.
Go ahead, you're
Okay.
fine.
Again, this isn't tied to any particular slide, but it kept running through my mind as I was reading through this. It's from 20 years ago, I think, a Bill Gates quote about we always overestimate the change we're gonna see in the next 2 years, and we always underestimate the change we're gonna see in the next 10 years. And I was just, you mentioned briefly Uber. We haven't brought up, autonomous or semi-autonomous vehicles, but what are you have such a long planning horizon. What are the trends that you're trying to track, you're trying to consider, to be mindful of, and the things that aren't even on your radar yet? What are some of those things, and how do they inform your processes?
I think, that's a really good point, and it's really difficult for us to measure some of those things or even look at some of that stuff, simply because the funding is it's up and down so much that we aren't able to even track the funding to determine what those needs might even be. So we spend a lot of time looking at the future, but trying to plan for it from a budget perspective is very, very difficult, because I'll be honest, transit funding is very limited, and it's not predictable. So we have a limited resource. For example, in Dollaride, we've had $1.3 million for the last 10 years. There's been no ups and downs, but it matters on, it's a flat level funding. And so, but we do look at things like that. We don't measure anything in terms of how to do that, but we do look at that in the future. And in fact, we're looking at doing something similar to Uber right now. We're working with MBTA to do that, but it's very difficult to plan for that.
There's been a lot of talk about autonomous cars, I think, recently, but there's a lot of technologies that we're tracking. The technology in cars has been in place for a while, but not all of it's being fully utilized by the automakers and what you purchase. So it'll take a while for everybody to have that kind of vehicle with that kind of capabilities. But it provides a lot of opportunities. There are things that we can do now with the technologies that provide stopping. And there may be different ways that we can approach safety rather than building a roundabout. Maybe we put some sort of electronic device on the signs that get people to stop. Those are all things that we need to be aware of that might change the future of the kinds of improvements that we make today. I think it's a good thing for all of us to be tracking in the new technologies and kind of how people change how they live, whether they do more telecommuting. I kind of laugh about when I was much younger, that they always said we were going to have a paperless office. And, I'm still waiting for that to happen. So it does take a long time for technology sometimes to become fully integrated in the system. So we just need to be aware, I think, of those things and keep tracking on them and keep changing how we do our jobs based on what's out there.
You know, can I just add one more thing when it comes to the long term of, what's the volumes of our roads going to be? That's a huge question, and we tack that in our comp plan, and we have models that show us, and help us kind of develop that. I always say that's more of a art than it is a science, even though, we're engineers looking at that, it's more of an art. And I think what we saw over the recession was really interesting because we saw traffic volumes climbing, and all of our models for 2030, when we did them 20 years ago, had all the, a lot of big, huge numbers in there. And now we're approaching 2030 and we're looking at redoing our comp plan to 2040. And I think what we're going to find is our 2030 numbers are going to carry through to 2040. They're not going to rise much. They're just going to kind of carry us through another 10 years because we didn't see that growth in the recession that we thought we would see, or that we were carrying through from the future. Now we're going to see that start to rise again. And I mean, I don't think that we necessarily have any idea how fast that's going to rise, how quickly it's going to rise, how quickly that's all going to come back. So it is an art, and that's why we, redo the comp plans, and that's why we do corridor studies, specific corridor studies as we look at this. So we have a comp plan that guides us overall, countywide. And then when we start looking, in our comp plans 5 years old, and we start looking at a corridor, that's why we kind of update all that with a little bit more detail for just that specific area and try to capture those changes maybe. But it's tough, yeah, definitely. And the autonomous cars, I don't even think touched what that's going to do to our traffic volumes. I don't think anybody on a national level has started even looking at what that's going to do to our future volumes.
Yeah, they talk about it reducing, but there's a lot of people that say it will increase.
Right.
Because people who aren't mobile today will be
Will
mobile.
be, yep.
And they've had smart plows and smart buses out on the street for many, many years already. And they still haven't even gotten to the point where they're going to be used that much. So,
Can you go to 19? I just want to ask, we talked about land use and development, and this is one the board is faced with at times. But what has the value been of 19, that chart, to Scott County?
Well, this in particular addresses development or turn lanes that have been installed countywide through development. And on page 20, there's a map of all the various locations, and it's pretty much been in every corner of the county where we've had either a right turn lane or a bypass lane or a left turn lane installed. And there's some research that was done by MnDOT that talked about the cost of turn lanes, and I think our turn lane cost is fairly similar. So over the course of, since 2000, the turn lanes that have been installed by development have probably added just under 10 million of investment to our system. So it's really significant. If we would have had to go in and mitigate for all of these developments and for the county to pay for all those turn lanes, it would have been the equivalent of about 1 year of our entire program. So it's very significant, the investment made through this development process.
Plays a role in safety, mobility, What's the benefits besides financial?
There's definitely a safety benefit, and there's a study that's been quoted in there, but it's anywhere from 20, some studies suggest up to 50% reduction in crashes at these intersections for right and left turn lanes, or bypass lane as well, bypass a little bit lower, but so there's definitely a safety benefit. Anytime there's a stopped vehicle in the roadway, that's a safety hazard. And so in rural locations, they're, 55 miles an hour, and at certain levels of roadway, you may encounter, so sometimes you're out there and say, well, I don't get why we're putting a turn lane in, there really isn't that many people out there. But when there is an event out there, okay, it is a high-speed event that happens. And so from a system-wide approach, we very strongly support the policy that's in place right now to put turn lanes at all of our intersections. And so I think we see a long-term system benefit. So it's more than just looking, we don't have a problem at this intersection, but the expectation with the driver is, over time is, that will be the expectation is, there are turn lanes at all of our intersections throughout the county. So if you have a corridor with 10 intersections and you have 8 with turn lanes and 2 that aren't, okay, that becomes a safety problem. And so we are moving in that direction with all of our intersections with turn lanes. So I think from a system point, there very much is a great benefit.
And that definitely seems to be something where we're ahead of the curve too, because it seems like when you drive around the metro area in other counties, you don't come across turn lanes as frequent. So I wonder if that really, on slide 11, helps drive up that metro crash rate too. So we're experiencing lower rates.
I think that does definitely add to it. And so you look at that slide 11 and showing that our crash rate is under that, that attributes to that. It's not just one intersection, but from a system standpoint, it's crash here, crash there, that all adds up.
So Tony, one more question. Jake had asked about mobility here. Page 26. We talked about safety and decision-making for corridors and projects, but that's not the only factor you folks use when looking at things. But this one, I think, impacts economics as well. Can you chat a little bit about this one of you?
Sure. On 26, this shows some projects that are in our program right now and what the delay is at those intersections, and what those level of services are. And the worst case scenario you see right there is 21 and 13, and I think most that drive through that area would recognize that. And in part because it's a split phase traffic signal. It's like one direction goes at a time, east and westbound through there. So it's very inefficient because we don't have the appropriate number of lanes and turn lanes there to make that an efficient intersection. So the delay is pretty great there. Conversely, if you look at 42, which we looked at that safety aspect, and again, that being one component of that on that other slide, is we've got a crash rate that's higher than the critical crash rate. So that math being more than 1.0 is, from a safety standpoint, we need to take a look at that corridor and find out specifically what's going on there. From a mobility standpoint, there's really not a lot of delay because there's not a lot of other conflicts out there. So we might look at those crashes and realize that they're run off the roads and things like that. So looking at all of these different factors, so we can come up with, where do we need to make investments from both a safety and mobility standpoint. Obviously the 42 and 13 intersection is as well there, shows a higher level of vehicle delay. At that intersection, I think most could attest to that drives through there as well.
Other questions from the panel? What data they use for decisions or policy, or? You can always pipe in. So now we'll take some questions. Mr. Chairman. We'll take some questions from the audience and the Board of Commissioners.
Okay,
And
any
anybody
questions or comments?
Yeah, anybody in the audience, just go up to the podium.
And don't all come up at once. Okay, no questions out. There's any questions from the board?
I'll just make a comment, Mr. Vice Chair, about I really enjoy and appreciate this format, that we were given all the information and we get right into the business, expecting that we already reviewed and read and took care of the information. I think this is a way we need to be working towards instead of, because you could have given an excellent hour-long presentation about all of this, but I don't know where my mind would have been after an hour presentation. This kept me hopping, so I really enjoy the format and appreciate it.
Good, great comment. Anyone else?
I was
Commissioner
just
Roth.
curious about one thing, it's not a major thing, but the pavement quality index, a visual survey every 4 years by MinDOT, is that the best way that that's done? I had thought, I'd heard that cities in our community that have an actual device that measures the quality of the pavement, and they do it, it's kind of an ongoing process, it's not waiting 4 years for information. I got it wrong, or?
I can't account for all the cities, but being a former City of Prairie Lake employee, they used a visual inspection with internal staff, driving around in an old cop car and just basing the information on the ride quality, amount of cracks, different things like that. The MinDOT van is a little bit more technical than visual. It does measure ride in that. Every 4 years, I would agree. We're kind of trying to look at possibly doing kind of every other year, just because our weather really has been playing a factor in things. But the 4 years on the state aid system is pretty general across the board with everybody.
Judith?
Okay, staying on the same graph we were just looking at, which is page 16, the pavement quality index. When you compare that to the next one, which is the citizen rating of road conditions, and obviously these are different years, so that the PCI, the last one was 2013, and that's actually your middle bar on the next one. But the PCI was the highest in 2013, and the citizens rating was also very high. How do you use these two together, or do you think they don't really correspond to each other at all?
Well, one of the challenges, I think, with the citizens rating is that it's very difficult for a citizen who's answering this to know whether or not they're on a county road, a city street, a state trunk highway. And so oftentimes when we look at this and the results from this, we're not really sure if the person who was answering it was really rating the county road system. So that's one of the challenges, I think, with the citizens survey. But we look at these for indications for how the citizens perceive pavement in the county. And we know for a fact that people do not make a distinction about what road they're on when they are gathering their intelligence and thinking about whether or not the road's good or not. So it is important for us to know whether or not the state's keeping up and the cities are keeping up on their pavement as well.
One other question is, it's a more global question, not in terms of any particular chart here, but first of all, I really appreciate your stepping up and doing this. I know it was kind of a last minute request of you, that you didn't have as much time as you normally would to prepare this, but you pulled together a group of people who do a lot of work together, but aren't necessarily normally doing these things together. Was there any specific thing or that came to your attention that surprised you as you did this, or any particular learning that you might not have gotten otherwise?
I think one of the things that surprised me is how many turn lanes we have installed since 2000 through development efforts, and that was kind of eye-opening for me anyway. I don't know about.
Yeah, I think this is, This has brought to light a number of different measures that we should be tracking and that we do want to track in the future. And I think, we'll be using this as kind of a springboard to do this in the future as well with additional tracking. My thoughts.
To build on Judas, if you were sitting here a year from now, which you will be, what is one thing you would like, what is one thing you'd like to see different? What would you hope? Or that you would have that you could talk about? It's hard to change some of these things over a year, I know that, but.
I think, from my perspective, I'd like to see us develop our data and have it more consistent across the board. And we have some data sets that we're just developing, and hopefully by next year we'll have them for the whole range, and that we're doing this stuff a little bit more systematically. We now kind of have figured out on the safety side what statistics we want to hone in on, and that over the course of the next year we can look at a lot of the corridors that we need to and have that readily accessible, and have dove a little bit deeper into the indicators to get at some of the details. I think we hope next year on the pavement side to have updated pavement information and more levels of detail as to how our system's faring and if we're making the investments at the right time. So those are a couple of the areas where I really hope we can make some extra ground next year.
Troy?
I think there's a lot of opportunity here. I think a couple of things come to my mind. When we're doing all this measurements and we're doing this and collecting this data, I think it's going to be really good for grant writing. I mean, to be able to have that access to that data. A lot of times when you're writing a grant, it's after the fact and you're looking at data, but this really helps and opens that door up to have all of this data for that purpose alone. Also, some of the things from a transit perspective, I like the idea that, I mean, I hear about this stuff and we work together, but a lot of times prior to this, we were measuring our own stuff and not really looking at each other's data. And I think moving forward, I think that's going to be really helpful. For example, when we are building busways and shelters and those kinds of things for transit, we're looking at land development and that kind of thing, and I don't think oftentimes transit was looked at from a transit perspective, from an operation perspective. I think today it's different, and I think as we move forward it'll be much different.
Leslie, can I make an observation?
You certainly can.
I'm noticing on chart 17, the big swing in citizens rating that Judith pointed out. First thing comes to my mind is what happened that year that was an extraordinary event. And I'm wondering in 2013 if the opening of Highway 21, County Road 21, was 3 or 4 miles of brand new pavement that had a huge impact on a lot of commuters. And if they were feeling pretty good about that. I just wonder out loud if that could have been it. Maybe the SAG in 2016 was because County Road 16 was torn up for 3 or 4 miles and impacted a lot of people. And we had a couple of projects like that might have people driving on detours or driving on torn up temporary roads or things like that. Just wondering out loud, when you get swings like that in public perception, if we should be asking ourselves what happened here to make that, to instigate that. I'm sorry I had to step out for a second. I'm glad for the vice chair, Wolfpick, taking over. Leslie, what do you want us to do now?
If there's more questions.
More
Cindy?
comments or questions?
Kathy?
Kathy always asks good questions.
Well, I don't know that I'm going to have great questions. So I appreciate Leslie inviting me to come and listen in. I did not have the data ahead of time, so I'm just going to ask a couple of questions in my 2 different capacities. So in my capacity as chair of the 50 by 30 steering committee, I was curious about the partners that you listed for the transportation initiative, and you included public health and health and human services when you were speaking, and I'm curious about how your conversations with those two service agencies inform the work that you do on the transportation side.
Well, I think with SmartLink, we worked regularly with Human Services, and so we do a lot of developing of our routes and the different things that we do for their services. And so we work hand in hand with that, also with the medical assistance program. So we work daily with those Human Services staff on the medical assistance trips that we provide.
Okay, thank you. I understand that. I was really curious now in my dual roles, from the township perspective and from the 50 by 30, you mentioned that a lot of your service denials are coming from the rural area. Do you have further detail on that?
We do, and we look at that. What happens is, because we only provide the dollar, I keep going back to the dollar rate, but that's what we focus on a
Right.
lot of. And we do, we only have dollar rate available from 6 in the morning until about 6 at night. And so the denials don't represent anything outside of that. And oftentimes we hear from the citizens that they want services outside of those hours, but we don't know that, and we have no data to support that. So we're trying to do surveys to figure that out. So, because we realize that that's a gap.
Is it 7 days a week, or is it just 6 to 6?
It's 5
Monday
days a
through
week.
Friday?
5 days a week, yep. So, and so if you don't ask the question, you don't get an answer. So we're trying to figure out that gap. In terms of the rural communities, Shakopee, Prior Lake, and Savage, they get fixed route services in and out of Minneapolis. They go to the Mall of America. They have all these services available to them. So those residents are getting good service in terms of where they want to go. It's the rural areas that really suffer. And, when you look at the cost per passenger for picking up somebody in, say, Elko New Market versus picking them up in Shakopee and taking them to Shakopee, they want to go from Elko to someplace, so the cost is extensive. And so we have to look at that as well. I don't know if I answered your question, but.
Could we map it? We could map where the denials are, though.
We do actually have maps that include where the denials are. We actually have address to address that we can look at, and zip code to zip code. But we can't share that data. We could summarize it and put that somehow on a graph. I suppose we could do that.
That would be helpful. I've been hearing a lot about the number of denials and the need for more volunteer drivers. It makes me curious about whether or not that's a story that needs to be presented to our faith communities. And especially when you talked about gaps in the rural area. And is there a different way that we could engage community members and faith communities as a partner?
And I think that's a really good idea. We've talked about on the weekends, especially on Sundays, we could provide that, we could mix that service between what we do with the faith communities and also with fixed route open public transit. So we've talked about some of those things, and we know that those needs are out there, but again, we have to use our resources that we have, and we have to increase resources to do that.
Yep.
Thank
Okay,
you.
I'm
Thank
going
you.
to put my township hat on now. Because you know that Spring Lake Township has a real tender spot when we come to conversations about turn lanes and the cost of turn lanes in the county's current policy. So it's great information to see that developers have contributed $10 million to county infrastructure here. And we're going to continue to have discussions on this issue because of the impacts, the unintended impacts the county policy is having on development in the rural area. Tony, you made a comment that the driver's expectation is that there'll be turn lanes at every intersection. Could you clarify that?
Well, just moving forward as development happens, and again, that's in our subdivision ordinance, to provide those turn lanes at those, so as they happen. And likewise, when we have projects on our roadways, we'll include turn lanes on those projects as well. So, maybe looking at County Road 8, for example, that we just recently reconstructed and opened up. We've got turn lanes at all of those intersections where we did not before. And so as we have projects come along, we will continue to incorporate those as well.
One last question, with respect to the studies that you referenced, indicating the effectiveness and the impact of having turn lanes. Do you know how many of those studies were conducted in rural areas?
I don't offhand, as far as the urban-rural split between those, so I can't comment on that. So I don't know if you can or not, but
No, I think the only thing that I can tell you is that's kind of why we put that range in there, that 25 to 30, is because all of those studies and where these numbers came from was the Crash Modification Factor Clearinghouse, which is a nationwide. So those clearinghouse numbers, as you look at that and say, okay, what is our crash reduction when you put in a right turn lane? You've got 5, 6, 7 different numbers that you can choose from, and then you kind of have to vet those out and look, okay, are they rural, are they urban, are they signalized intersections, unsignalized intersections? So we can break all that out as we look at that, and that's kind of why that range was given, because it does vary. I'm not sure, and I can't tell you off the top of my head, what that percentage, if it's higher in the rural or urban, I'm not sure, but that data is there, and that's why that range was given.
Okay, that would be good to know. All right, thank you.
Go ahead, Jay.
Okay. I'm just curious, as a library guy, with Chris brought up ignorance, and I think I'm confident I exceed her in my ignorance of this topic. So let's say, I'm going to give you sort of a hypothetical situation, and how would you respond? So everybody, all the library folks at the Marshall Road Transit Station, we decide we're going to call up your department because coming out of Marshall Road, the transit station, that road, to try and take a left onto County Road 16, we believe it feels dangerous, that's not safe. It feels dangerous to us. We're giving you some information from our perspective, and we're adamant about it. What do you do to respond to that? Because you're getting some information, and it's perception. So how do you take that information, and then once you get something like that, what do you evaluate that against?
Well, I will say, because I've fielded a lot of calls since I've been here, and I enjoy, and I always tell the public when they call and they feel like they're complaining or whatever, I said, it's great you called, because, you drive it, every single day, and we've got a pretty good handle on what's out there, but we don't drive it every single day like you do. So anytime you feel that there's an issue out there, pick up the phone and give us a call, because we want to go feel and see what that's like as well. So we're, like that particular intersection, we're well aware of that intersection. And so we are looking at that, and I'm sure some say, well, we'll just put in a traffic signal because that's an easy fix-all. I'll be able to get out, and it'll be the easy fix-all. But there's signal warrants and things like that that have to be met. Otherwise, we'd have signals every quarter mile everywhere because everybody feels my intersection's the worst and I need a traffic signal. So that is an intersection in particular that we continue to monitor to understand what is going on there, because we don't want to put in a signal, for example, that isn't warranted, and then we're creating other problems elsewhere. We've got a proximity, that whole area right there, you got a proximity to 17, that's real close. You've got some capacity issues at that particular intersection as well. And so while it might feel really bad for, an hour or two, the vast majority, there might be 22 other hours of the day where it really isn't a problem getting out there. So would you really make that sort of change out there for, a short period of time, a short window? So we look at all of those things, and people still have the opportunity to make a right and then make a U-turn a quarter mile down there, or less than a quarter mile in that particular location. So, but we really do want to hear from the public, those areas in which they feel might be problematic, so we can investigate. And that one in particular we're well aware of, and we continue to monitor that, both from a safety standpoint, mobility standpoint along that corridor. It's an arterial corridor there as well, and how that might interact with County Road 17's operations as well.
So you just you don't just hear from a group of people and say, great, we're gonna do what you think is best, that the general public or traffic engineers, you actually go back and look at the data that you have and try to study the issue a little bit more.
Absolutely. As Lisa mentioned earlier, we're very much a data-driven group, and we have to be in everything we do to make, sound engineering decisions in what we're doing.
Why do I have the feeling that Tony's phone's gonna ring all next week?
So I would agree with what Tony said, and I would just add on, especially at the location. So depending, kind of the seriousness of what the complaint is and, how many times that, complaint has come in. Sometimes things elevate a little bit as more people call in. But we certainly do. We always kind of take a look at crash history. There's certain things we take a look at with that. The Marshall one that you're talking about, we're actually have kind of elevated that a little bit more. Recently, we're actually modeling that, taking a look at what different traffic control in that area will do to congestion, to safety, to all that thing. So we're kind of in the process really of that area, kind of being a full-blown traffic impact study, if you will, more so than I think maybe when I first got here a year ago, we started to take a look at just that typical, the crash data. The crash data is not telling us there's a problem out there. But we just keep getting the word, and we keep getting word that there's issues. So we've kind of taken that to the next step. So
Commissioner Ulrich has
that's
a-
kind of how that evolves, really.
That's an area too where we've seen operations increase, so there's a lot more people using the transit station. And that was kind of a benchmark where we said we probably should be taking a look and reevaluating things. Another piece that we're really trying to work on is that there is a transit advantage located on that facility to get the buses out directly onto the freeway system rather than having to use the local system. And for those of you that are at that facility probably know we've had some operation issues with that gate, and we're working really hard to try to get those resolved so that the buses won't need to go back out on County Road 16 to complete their route, that they'll be able to use that advantage. So we're trying to look at those kinds of things as well.
Commissioner Ulrich has a comment.
Yeah, I would wonder about, and I don't know if this is outside the scope of what you've got going here, but I'm wondering about maintenance dollars and the payoff of maintenance dollars, and are we spending enough, and is there data that would show if we spend more upfront with maintenance dollars, how much further are we ahead? Just give you a layman's idea of what I'm talking about. When I'm driving around and it's late fall and it's raining out and we're moving to freezing weather, and I see all these cracks in the road, I go, oh man, these are just going to be, because these weren't sealed, these cracks, this, after winter, this is going to be much worse, and so my question is, do you have data that tells us how much we should be spending and the payoff of spending more or less?
Well, we're working on that data. They were trying to put together, a long range, for sure, 5-year up to 10-year plan and beyond. Realistically, you'll never ever get to securing all those cracks in areas. I mean, some roads are just at that point where you need to let them be until you can resurface or reconstruct. But I'll let Lisa answer a little bit more about the future plans as far as dollars.
Well, we're in the process right now of really digging into that data, Commissioner, to try to get a better handle on, are we spending enough? Are we keeping up with those maintenance practices that we know are industry standards? And if not, how much more would we need to invest to do that? And we're hoping we have that coming forward to you within the next few months, hopefully in March. We'll be bringing some of that information to you at the Transportation Committee and to board workshops as we talk about are we keeping up, and are there things we should be doing, investing more in. So.
Anything else that's important to your goals, to the outcomes that you were looking at today that we didn't ask you about, that you really want to speak to? seems like.
While you're pondering that, Commissioner Brecky has a question or a comment.
I just have 2 comments that'll give you a little more time. One, having to do, with a big geographic area of District 1 in the south and western part of the county is agriculturally based. It probably will remain that way for several decades, if not forever. But I think that's an important thing, that when we talk about economic development and you're starting to further develop those measures, that's really considered, because as you know, you're planning for autonomous cars and all these things, but then in part of the county, you're needing to consider in your planning the farm equipment of today that's very, very wide, and the economic reality of agriculture in that part of the county isn't that you're driving your combines and tractors that I can't even quote how wide they are now, because it'll just make a fool of myself, but not just within your own little section or your 120 or 200 acres. You're driving it among 1,000 or 1,500 acres across many county roads, sometimes our highway, things like that. So I just want to bring that up, and I think that might be a neat measure, not a neat measure, a very informative measure to use on parts of our county, because we have so many differences there. And then my second comment has to do with, this is just such great information that I think we talked a little bit about the public, but even more importantly is for our other jurisdictions to understand, the townships, the cities, and oftentimes I think the county has to play the role of the big heavy about, okay, we got to do this on our county road and this, but giving them this kind of information in a neutral setting, I think could really improve our relations with some of those jurisdictions and get everybody, as we all are, make sure we remember we're all on the same team. So just some thoughts for further development of the good work you've done so far.
Thank you.
Maybe to react a little bit and hopefully address Chris's question, is that at least on the 10-ton road system, I think that farm equipment is a factor in how big our 10-ton road system is and what we do to try to support agriculture. I can think of another thing that we've been trying to deal with, is that sometimes our safety investments impact agriculture's ability to move their equipment around. One of those is roundabouts, and I know we've had a lot of dialogue with farmers down in the Elko New Market area and elsewhere in the county as we put in those kinds of improvements in the system and how it impacts their movement. Chart Industries is a good example of challenges that roundabouts present and things we need to think about in designing those types of things. With regard to the data, I think one of the things that the work that we've done here over the last year has really brought to light is we've done a road show for many years now, I think probably 8, going on 9 years, where we go out and educate elected officials, and that a lot of the data that we've collected here is really proof for a lot of the philosophical underpinnings that we're trying to articulate in that process. Why do we promote access management? Why do we promote the development of turn lanes? Why do we need to coordinate land use with our transportation system? And how do compliance with the plans and building new infrastructure in conformance with those visions, how does that impact mobility? A lot of that data is now put together in a form that people can look at it and see the results. And I think that's important because we continue to be challenged as we move forward, because we have new elected officials, we have new residents in our communities, and they weren't around when those studies were done, so we need to continue to educate people. And I think really looking at our outcomes and showing not just statewide data, why did this make a difference, when we can bring it down to the county level and the corridor level, it helps people understand that we're just not out there being engineers and planners with big visions, that it does make a difference. It promotes their health, safety, and mobility. And that's what we need to communicate.
Okay. Kathy?
I have a couple of questions about page 41. Looking at your fixed transit routes. So this graph is showing the number of transit trips and the total hours of service that are being provided, but it doesn't show the ridership. I'm wondering what, so I think it would be helpful to include the number of average riders you have a day to give a context to the number of people that are actually being served. But then I guess my questions are, what are the criteria that are used to determine whether or not these routes are successful, whether or not the investment being made is an appropriate return on investment for the public?
I can answer some of that for you. So the Met Council has standards in terms of what their routes are and how productive they are. And they distribute all the funds out to each of the communities. So for the opt-outs, for example, Southwest gets their pot of money from the regional dollars and MBTA gets their pot of money. And they kind of determine what they want to do with their own money in terms of what services they want to provide and what they think rises to the top. And then the Met Council has standards, and I don't know exactly from a fixed routes point of view what their standards are. But I know that, you know, and Dial-A-Ride has a whole different set of standards. So from a Dial-A-Ride perspective, the standards in the region are typically at 2 passengers per hour, where we're at 5. I can't say that, and there's different routes that work differently with the rest of the other communities. But with fixed route services, it becomes very challenging because you want to provide peak service so that people can use it, but you also have to offer off-peak service or they won't be successful. So even though you have an off-peak route where the passengers are 2 passengers per hour, and you really want, on a fixed route service, I think it's more like 12 to 15 passengers per hour is what they really look at. And in order to make that 12 to 15 work at peak times, you have to offer it in the midday service so they have an opportunity to get home. So there's different ways of looking at it, and they could put the passengers in here to give you a better picture, but without understanding all those details, looking at a graph, it'd be very difficult to explain. I don't know if that makes sense, but we could put the number of trips and the number of passengers on this chart, but it would be very difficult to look at from an operational perspective.
So you talked about Met Council having standards. How much of the funding for these routes is coming through Met Council versus the county?
Probably almost 100%.
Yeah, 98%.
Yeah, this year will be the first year that the county is actually going to be contributing to some select services through the sales tax program, some operating dollars. But historically, all of that money comes through the region.
Okay.
The one other thing about this particular graph, and we did present some information to the Collective Impact Transportation Committee. We're continuing to gather data on ridership. And this is the current level of service, and we don't have annual ridership information available yet for a lot of these routes because they've been retooled and kind of revamped over the last year. So the data will come, and we do have some preliminary data, but if we're looking at historical data, it's not going to match up route by route.
Sure. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Leslie,
We're good.
You ready for us to say a few words and wrap up the meeting this morning? Is that where we're at? We're all kind of winging this, members. We wanted to sit through a presentation of delivering what matters. Thank you for doing that. Further comments or insights from any of the board members? Well, thank you for saying, you put every department through this, this kind of an exercise, don't you, Leslie? Right,
Yes,
so-
we do. Each department over the past couple of years has started to put their information and their data together. Some are more advanced than others. It's a work in progress. And as we move forward through this year with the board, some of them will be specific strategic initiatives you have and where we're at and the maturity of each one of those.
Mhm. Well, thank you for doing that, and nice work, people. Nice work. Members, we are going to, are we